In the quiet countryside where everyone knew everyone else's name, the Ellington residence stood as a symbol of grace, charm, and compassion. A sprawling Victorian manor with ivy crawling up its brick walls and wind chimes always ringing gently by the porch. It was the kind of home most people only saw in storybooks. Townsfolk admired it not only for its beauty but for the kindness of those who lived within, Mr. and Mrs. Ellington. They were known for opening their doors to children in need. Over 3 decades, dozens of children were placed in their care. Orphans, runaways, even infants found abandoned in the cold. None were ever turned away. The Ellingtons were seen as saints. No one questioned how they managed it. Mr. Ellington was a retired physician. Mrs. Ellington ran a flower shop that rarely saw customers. Yet their table was always full, their pantry never empty. The children wore clean clothes, attended school, and were often seen playing in the yard under the large oak trees, laughter echoing in the crisp morning air. They called the Ellingtons Ma and Pa, and outsiders found it heartwarming. But there were oddities, small ones, the kind that people notice but never really investigate. A teacher once remarked that a girl named Lottie had been in her class 3 years running, but she hadn't moved up a grade. She looked the same, acted the same. No one thought much of it. Another woman swore she remembered a boy named Peter staying with the Ellingtons when she was a child, and now her own daughter had Peter in her class, looking exactly as she remembered. Must be a cousin, she reasoned aloud, though unease twisted in her gut. Photographs on the Ellingtons' hallway walls spanned decades, capturing birthdays, picnics, and holidays. But as the years went by, visitors began to notice something else. Children who should have grown up still looked startlingly the same in every frame. There was a boy with bright auburn curls and a chipped front tooth, grinning in a 1982 Christmas photo, and again in a 1996 Easter picture with the same shirt, same tooth, same curls. Still, no one said anything. The Ellingtons were masters of charm. Mrs. Ellington especially had a disarming way about her, with a voice as soft as cotton and eyes that never blinked too long. She had stories for every child, where they came from, how they'd been found. The townsfolk believed her because they wanted to believe in goodness. "These poor children," she'd say, gently brushing a girl's hair back. "They've been through so much. We don't talk about the past. Only healing forward." When someone tried to visit, the Ellingtons welcomed them, but only in certain rooms. The kitchen, the parlor, the garden, the upstairs, where the children slept, was always off-limits. "They're shy," Mr. Ellington would explain. "You know how kids are." Most guests nodded along, sipping tea that always tasted just a bit too bitter. No child ever left the Ellington home, at least not publicly. There were no records of adoption finalizations, no court visits, no reassignments. Just arrival, then silence. Neighbors assumed the children simply stayed until they were old enough to move out and live their lives. But curiously, no one in town could name a single Ellington child who grew up and returned to visit. The children at the Ellington house never grew tall, never hit puberty, never developed acne, broke curfews, or brought home report cards with failing grades. They just remained. It wasn't until someone from the city came, an out-of-town caseworker curious about the lack of aging in a group of supposedly normal children, that a new layer of unease crept into the community's otherwise blind trust. She asked questions others had avoided. Why were there no school transfers? Why didn't any child have a medical history past their intake file? Why did the birthdays of certain children remain the same on every form, year after year? And why, despite all the names listed in the Ellingtons' care, did the town never see more than 7 or 8 children at a time? As the caseworker pushed further, she noticed how quickly the Ellingtons shifted. No longer so warm, no longer so welcoming. Her requests for in-home visits were delayed, then denied. Her phone calls began going unanswered, and when she finally drove up to the manor unannounced, the front door remained closed despite the sound of footsteps and giggles echoing just behind it. She wasn't the first to wonder. Years earlier, a former census taker had written in his notebook, "Same faces, same names. They looked wrong." He never followed up. Neither did the substitute mailman who delivered packages marked with no return address, heavy and cold to the touch, and always signed for by a child who didn't blink. The Ellingtons' home remained the same through the years. Immaculate, quiet, eternal. And the children, they were always there, always smiling, always young. The Ellington home was full of portraits. Not the kind you buy at flea markets or hang to impress dinner guests. These were deeply personal, lovingly painted, and eerily consistent. Lining the corridors and walls of the sitting room, dozens of oil portraits depicted children in a variety of poses. Some reading, some standing with a pet, others holding old-fashioned toys. Each canvas bore a brass plate engraved with a name and a year. Lottie, 1985. Peter, 1992. Abigail, 2001. The brushwork was delicate, almost too precise. Visitors often remarked on how lifelike the images were. Their expressions, in particular, were haunting, eyes wide, smiles perfectly still, yet somehow hollow, as if the soul behind them had been paused mid-thought. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Many families keep photographs or paintings of their children. It was easy to assume that the Ellingtons, who devoted their lives to fostering, simply wished to commemorate the young lives they had touched. But with each visit, the paintings began to tell a story no one dared acknowledge. Some guests began to notice something unsettling. Children didn't seem to age between portraits. A girl in a yellow dress appeared in one portrait marked 1987, again in 1993, then once more in 2002. Always the same soft curls, the same innocent tilt of her head. A boy with a striped cap held the same wooden toy train across 3 paintings separated by nearly a decade. Even more unnerving were the dates. There was no progression. One child had a portrait from 1984, then another from 1990, same posture, same size, same face. Time didn't seem to pass for these children. Or, more chillingly, something was keeping them exactly as they were. People whispered about it, but only behind closed doors. The Ellingtons would smile politely if a visitor mentioned the portraits. "Precious memories," Mrs. Ellington would say, dusting a frame lovingly. "We like to remember them as they were when they first arrived." If asked why so many portraits looked so recent, why a painting from 2004 seemed to be of a child in 1980s clothing, she would laugh softly and change the subject. Mr. Ellington was even less forthcoming. He rarely spoke of the children at all except in vague, nostalgic terms. Some of the portraits had peculiar traits that no one could explain. A boy's shadow fell the wrong way, defying the direction of light from the painted window. A girl's pupils were so dark they seemed to absorb light in the room. One painting even had a strange, oily shimmer, as though something wet beneath the surface hadn't fully dried, despite being years old. An art restorer once visited at Mrs. Ellington's request. She claimed a few paintings needed cleaning. He left midway through the job, pale and silent. When pressed, he only muttered, "Those aren't paintings." There was also the issue of the frames. Every single portrait hung in identical frames, carved in a style no one could identify. Not Victorian, not Edwardian, not even colonial replicas. They were ornate, covered in looping patterns that, when stared at too long, seemed to writhe ever so slightly. The brass plates were all the same size, all engraved with the same sharp serif lettering. Someone once took a rubbing of one and compared it with another. The lettering wasn't just similar, it was identical, as if stamped by the same hand, or by a machine that hadn't aged a day. Some of the older townspeople began to recall that the same children had been in those paintings back when they were young. A woman named Ruth swore she had seen the girl in the yellow dress during a church potluck in the early 1990s. She even remembered the child humming a strange melody while standing by the punch bowl. That same girl now appeared, unchanged, in the Ellingtons' hallway portrait, her smile untouched by time. Others shared similar recollections. A red-haired boy who was once in the Christmas pageant still peered out from a painting labeled 1986, though no one could remember him graduating, moving, or even aging. School yearbooks were no help. Some of the names matched up with students who had briefly enrolled in the local elementary or middle school. But those records stopped suddenly. No graduation photos, no high school entries. Just a sudden drop-off, followed by nothing. The children simply vanished from the system, though their images remained fixed on canvas in that silent house. On quiet nights, passers-by claimed they saw candlelight flickering inside the portrait room. Sometimes they thought they heard murmurs, soft voices, childlike giggles, like a room full of children whispering behind closed doors. One man who worked for the electric company claimed he was let inside once to check on a faulty line. He said the portrait room was colder than the rest of the house, not just cool, freezing, and all the children's eyes seemed to follow him as he worked. He finished quickly, refusing the Ellingtons' usual offer of tea, and never returned. The town of Grayson Hollow had always been small, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where the general store clerk knew everyone's middle name, and where news traveled faster than wind. In such a place, secrets shouldn't have lasted more than a few hours. Yet somehow, the truth about the Ellingtons slipped through cracks as if carried by something colder than silence. It wasn't that people didn't notice the oddities. They did. But noticing and acknowledging are different things. Most chose the former and carefully avoided the latter. The Ellingtons, for all their quirks, had built a reputation that made it difficult to question them without looking cruel. They had, after all, taken in dozens of children who would have otherwise disappeared into the foster system. The town respected that, admired it even. When rumors emerged, strange sightings, missing paperwork, children who never seemed to age, it was easier to explain them away than to confront the discomfort they brought. Children can look alike, some would say. You must have seen the cousin, not the same kid. Others chalked it up to sentimental confusion. You're probably just misremembering. Time plays tricks. There was also a sense of indebtedness. The Ellingtons often donated to church functions, hosted summer picnics, and sent hand-picked flowers to widows on holidays. Mrs. Ellington brought pies to every bake sale. Mr. Ellington quietly paid for repairs at the schoolhouse one winter when the boiler gave out. People wanted to believe in their goodness because it validated the town's image of itself. A good town full of good people. To suggest something sinister lurked behind those lace curtains would mean challenging not just the Ellingtons, but the community's own identity. Local officials, too, had a role in the silence. The town's sheriff, an aging man named Dalton Reeves, had once investigated a missing persons report involving a child who had allegedly been dropped off at the Ellington home by a social worker. There were no records of her arrival, no school registration, no follow-up visits. Sheriff Reeves knocked on their door, asked a few polite questions, and left after 10 minutes with a smile and a slice of Mrs. Ellington's cranberry loaf wrapped in wax paper. He never filed a report. When asked about it later, he said the child had been placed with another family, but no one could find out where. Over time, people stopped asking. School staff noticed things too. Children who never aged weren't just a visual anomaly, they behaved differently. Teachers commented on how quiet they were. Too quiet, obedient to the point of unsettling. They rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, their words felt rehearsed, emotionless. One substitute teacher described their stares as glass-like, as if they were observing her through a lens rather than with real curiosity. But permanent staff discouraged complaints. They've been through trauma, the principal would remind. Don't make it worse by poking around. Neighbors sometimes saw glimpses of things they couldn't explain. A child digging in the garden late at night under a full moon. A sudden scream that was quickly muffled. A silhouette standing motionless in an upstairs window for hours. But the Ellingtons always had explanations. Nightmares, they said. The little ones have trouble sleeping. No one wanted to be the one who doubted them. No one wanted to seem heartless. Even the town's pastor, Reverend Claymore, once confided to his wife that something about the Ellington children felt spiritually wrong. He described an uneasy sensation when blessing them during Easter service. Their eyes don't blink during prayer, he whispered. But when pressed to speak publicly, he demurred. It's not my place to judge, he finally said from the pulpit. God sees all, and he will sort what's righteous. What made the silence even more potent was the way the Ellingtons shielded the children from outsiders. They didn't attend public events often. The children were homeschooled during certain periods without explanation. When questioned, Mrs. Ellington would mention illness or emotional stress. "They're delicate," she'd say with a sorrowful smile. "We do what's best for them." Every once in a while, a stranger would arrive in town. An old friend of a birth parent, a caseworker reassigned to dig into a file, a curious journalist following up on a tip. They never stayed long. They came with questions but left with nothing. Or sometimes they didn't leave at all. One reporter, a woman named Eliza who'd been writing a piece on rural foster care, was last seen heading toward the Ellington home just after dusk. Her car was found 2 days later in a grocery store parking lot 40 miles away, keys still in the ignition. Her article was never published. The town's paper ran a brief blurb about a possible disappearance but didn't link it to the Ellingtons. People talked, of course, behind closed doors, at night, in hushed voices while candles flickered, but never in public, never where it could be written down or taken seriously. It was easier to call it superstition, easier to pretend the stories were just stories, easier to say nothing at all. There was a room in the Ellington house that no one had ever entered, at least no one who spoke of it afterward. It was located on the second floor, at the end of a narrow hallway where the wallpaper peeled slightly and the wood beneath the carpet creaked with every step. The door to the room was always locked, always shut, and always cold to the touch, even during the peak of summer. It was unremarkable at a glance. Plain oak with an old brass knob, but there was something about it that made visitors pause. The children never mentioned it. In fact, they seemed trained to look past it entirely. Their eyes would slide over it. Their footsteps would unconsciously grow lighter near it, and if asked about it directly, they would either smile blankly or quickly change the subject. Neighbors recalled strange noises from that side of the house. Not the expected rustling or settling of an old building, but soft voices, childlike whispers that never sounded like playing. The whispers came in flurries, fast and rhythmic, like chanting or reciting. Sometimes, there were low thuds, as if furniture was being moved across the floor, followed by silence so complete it pressed against the ears. On stormy nights, one neighbor swore she heard a lullaby coming from an open upstairs window, sung in a voice too old and too sad to belong to any of the children. When questioned, the Ellingtons brushed off the noises. "Old pipes," Mr. Ellington would say. "This place is over 100 years old." But the pipes never made sounds like laughter, and old houses didn't murmur. An exterminator once came to the house for what was described as a mild pest issue. He worked quickly through the cellar and kitchen, and when he asked to inspect the upstairs rooms, Mrs. Ellington grew oddly flustered. She agreed reluctantly, but stopped him short as he approached the end of the hall. "That room's empty," she said curtly. "We keep it locked to avoid dust buildup." The exterminator paused, unsure, but her eyes told him not to push further. As he turned away, he heard something from behind the door, a soft giggle, then a shushing noise, like a finger pressed to lips. Later, he told his brother it had felt like being watched. Not by someone standing near him, but by someone behind the walls. Another visitor, a piano tuner named Wallace, had a similar encounter. He was halfway through adjusting the old upright in the parlor when a ball rolled down the stairs and landed at his feet. A child's ball, red and scuffed. Thinking a child had dropped it, he brought it to the foot of the stairs and called up. No one answered, just the sound of a door clicking shut very slowly, at the top. When he later asked Mrs. Ellington about the locked room, she grew still and stared at him with a strange expression. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of pity. "Some doors," she said, "don't open for just anyone." The room had no light under the door, no drafts, no smell, just silence. Yet on some mornings, the housekeeper noticed the doorknob had shifted slightly, as if turned during the night. Once, she claimed the door was open by an inch, just enough to see darkness inside. No shapes, no furniture, no color. She said the shadows inside felt heavy, like they had weight. She never mentioned it again after that day. The children, when left alone near the room, behaved differently. They didn't run, laugh, or even walk past it. One boy, no older than 8, stopped suddenly as he reached the door and began to cry quietly. When asked what was wrong, He simply said, "She's still in there," before being hurried away by Mrs. Ellington, who offered no explanation. Some townsfolk speculated that the room was once a nursery, long before the Ellingtons lived there. Others claimed it had been sealed for decades, even before the house passed into their hands. A few old-timers swore that a girl had died in that room, a child named Clara, whose spirit never left. They said the Ellingtons never spoke of her, that her name had been erased from all records, and that every child who came into the house was told the same thing: never open that door. A former delivery driver reported something odd after dropping off a package of antique books. As he was leaving, he heard music coming from the upstairs, the soft notes of a music box, repeating a single melody. He paused on the front step, recognizing the tune from a lullaby his grandmother used to sing. As he turned to look back, he thought he saw a small hand pull the curtain aside from the window above the locked room. The curtain closed again before he could make out the face behind it. No one ever saw that room in daylight. No one ever saw the Ellingtons bring anyone in or out of it. But its presence lingered in the house like a held breath. The questions had lingered in the town for decades, buried beneath polite smiles and years of willful ignorance. But eventually, someone came along who wasn't from Grayson Hollow. Someone who hadn't grown up eating Mrs. Ellington's rhubarb pie or attending church picnics where the children in the Ellington yard waved sweetly but never played with anyone else. Her name was Marian Dwyer, a regional child welfare investigator assigned to update dormant foster files that had fallen through the cracks. She was methodical, quiet, and used to seeing the worst in people. What she wasn't used to was being treated with such careful, curated kindness that it immediately felt artificial. Her first visit to the Ellington house was by appointment. The home itself was everything the files promised: immaculate, tasteful, charming. Mr. and Mrs. Ellington greeted her with practiced warmth, offering fresh-baked cookies and herbal tea. The children were introduced one by one, all polite, soft-spoken, and strangely still. It took only minutes for Marianne to notice something wrong. One of the children, Peter, was listed as 8 years old in a file from nearly 10 years ago. He still looked 8. His file hadn't been updated since 2015, and his birth certificate was a photocopy of a photocopy, stamped and initialed by a now-retired clerk who had since passed away. When she gently brought this up, Mrs. Ellington smiled and said, "He's small for his age." Marian didn't argue, yet. She made notes, asked for updated documents, and left feeling like she'd stepped out of a staged play. Everything had been too perfect. The children's answers had been too uniform, as though they were following a script. And behind it all was a tension, a faint crackling in the atmosphere, like static under polished wallpaper. She returned unannounced 3 days later. This time, she was kept waiting on the porch for almost 20 minutes before Mr. Ellington appeared, slightly out of breath, claiming they had been mid-nap. It was just past 11 a.m. Marianne asked to see the children again, and he hesitated before agreeing. This time there were fewer of them, only 5. Peter was absent. "He's feeling unwell," said Mrs. Ellington from the hallway. "Too many questions last time. He's sensitive." Something in Marianne's gut told her to push further, but she maintained her professionalism. She requested access to upstairs living quarters for a safety inspection. The Ellingtons declined. "We respect our children's privacy," Mrs. Ellington explained, her voice tight behind a serene expression. "They deserve safe boundaries, especially after trauma." Marianne made a note of the refusal. Back at her regional office, she pulled older case files and began connecting them. Names repeated across decades, birth dates that never aged, children registered as placed with the Ellingtons again and again, but no documentation of them aging out, being transferred, or adopted. Even stranger, some names were duplicated in different counties. A girl named Lottie appeared in a file from 1987 and again in 2006. Same name, same description, same sad smile in the ID photo. She called the State Archive for physical files. Pages were missing from at least 4. Her supervisor urged caution. "That house is a political powder keg," he warned. "They're practically local heroes." But Marian pressed forward. She reached out to a retired teacher who'd once reported a concern about the Ellington children, anonymously. The woman's hands shook when they met for coffee. "They never blinked," she whispered. "You ever see children just not blink?" Marian applied for a court order to access the full home and speak with all the children in private. It was denied, no sufficient cause. The Ellingtons had never violated any official code. Their inspections had always come back clean. There were no abuse claims on file, no criminal history, no concrete reason to suspect wrongdoing. But Marian knew something was wrong. She went back again, without an appointment, and parked on the opposite side of the street. She watched the house from her car. Hours passed. The front door opened only once. A girl stepped out carrying a bucket and placed it by the garden shed. Marian recognized her as a child listed in the 2009 file. She should have been an adult by now. The girl looked no older than 10. As she bent over to place the bucket, her sleeve slipped, revealing something etched into the skin of her arm. Marian couldn't make it out from the distance, but it was dark and sharp. She raised her camera and took a photo. She tried again for access, called in old favors, reached out to a state-level investigator. Every attempt stalled. Her emails went unanswered. Her calls were dropped. When she returned to the house once more the following week, it looked slightly different. The curtains were drawn tighter. A new no trespassing sign had been added to the front gate. But she noticed something else, too. The mailbox had been removed entirely, as if no one there was receiving mail anymore. Or perhaps as if they didn't want to be found. It was the odor that first tipped off the handyman. A dense, coppery scent that clung to the walls of the basement staircase, seeping up through the cracks in the floorboards above. He'd been called to fix a water heater. Mrs. Ellington met him at the door with her usual smile, overly warm and almost brittle, like porcelain kept too long in the sun. She led him to the cellar door and offered to accompany him, but he declined, preferring to work alone. She hesitated for a second too long before stepping aside. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, the wood beneath his boots groaning as he descended. The light bulb at the bottom flickered once before steadying. The basement itself was larger than he expected, partially finished, partially raw. The far side of the room was shrouded in darkness, even with the bulb above him. There was the heater, rusted and humming weakly, but his attention was immediately drawn elsewhere. On the left wall were rows of old furniture. Broken chairs, cracked mirrors, and dusty cribs stacked unnaturally high. Toys too, wooden blocks, headless dolls, stuffed animals missing limbs. All of it looked untouched for years, yet none of it had gathered dust. Each object looked arranged, intentionally displayed, as if someone had curated a museum of discarded childhood. Then there were the jars. They lined a shelf near the far corner, barely visible in the low light. He moved toward them, squinting. Inside the cloudy glass floated pale shapes, small, indistinct, and motionless. He counted at least 7. He turned quickly, heart pounding, and nearly tripped over something embedded in the floor. It was a ring of symbols etched into the concrete, stained dark as if something had been poured or spilled over it repeatedly. The pattern didn't resemble anything he recognized. Not artistic, not random. Ritualistic. In the center of the circle was what looked like a child's shoe, perfectly clean, sitting upright as if placed there moments ago. The basement was too cold for summer. The air felt thick, unmoving. He fixed the heater in a daze, refusing to look toward the darker part of the room. As he returned upstairs, he found Mrs. Ellington already waiting, her hand on the doorknob, smiling as if nothing were out of place. He left without charging her. Later that week, he told a friend what he'd seen. A week after that, he quit his job and moved 2 counties over. When asked about the Ellington house, he only said, "Don't go down there." Years later, when the property was briefly put up for sale after a rumored legal review, a real estate agent was allowed in to appraise it. She brought a photographer, but his camera stopped functioning once they reached the basement stairs. The agent descended alone and returned less than 3 minutes later, visibly shaking. She claimed there was mold and water damage, nothing more. Her listing was pulled the next day. She moved out of town within the month. It wasn't until Marion Dwyer, the same investigator who had been following the Ellington foster files, managed to obtain an unofficial entry through a whistleblower tip that the basement was explored in depth. She arrived with a flashlight, a recorder, and a local deputy who had agreed to accompany her in secret. What they found confirmed years of suspicion, and then surpassed them. In the far back wall of the basement was a second door, concealed behind a false panel made to look like shelves. It had no handle, only a keyhole. Inside the room beyond, the air dropped sharply in temperature. The smell intensified. It was windowless, small, and filled with what at first looked like ordinary items. Blankets, children's shoes, broken toys. But the way they were arranged made it feel like a shrine. Candles had melted into pools along the baseboards. Handwritten notes in a childlike scrawl were pinned to the walls, most with only a few words: "Stay quiet, don't grow, time hurts." A large wooden chest sat in the middle of the room. It was nailed shut. The deputy pried it open with the claw end of his flashlight. Inside were clothing items tagged with old orphanage labels. Names that matched those from missing children reports, some dating back nearly 40 years. Marion found a ledger tucked inside. A journal, written in Mrs. Ellington's looping cursive. It documented entries about cycles, preservation rituals, and phrases that chilled the blood. Peter resisted again. He must be reset. And Lottie's smile is fading. The youth is thinning. Begin the chant before dusk. In a final alcove carved crudely into the foundation was a mirror. Tall, gilt-framed, and cracked across the surface. The reflection inside it didn't match their movements. It was delayed, off by seconds, as if watching through a different time. At one point, Marion stepped too close, and the deputy pulled her back. The surface of the mirror had begun to ripple like water. When they left the basement, the children were standing silently at the top of the stairs. All 7 of them in a perfect line, their expressions flat. The youngest one held a key. None of them said a word. The deputy reported none of it. Marianne's findings were buried in paperwork and bureaucracy. The Ellingtons remained untouched by the law. But she kept a single photograph, taken in the basement with an old Polaroid camera, developed in silence. In the image was the room with the mirror, and in the reflection were far more children than had ever been seen in that house. 5.